Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the WaterTalk. My name is Roy Brouwer, Director of the Water Institute. We're very happy to see you all here today. Before I introduce the speaker of today, I just want to acknowledge that I participate today here from traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Holdman Tract that you can see here. Land granted to the Six Nations, and that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And here on the slide, you see where the Six Nations Reserve is based. It's around 5% of the original piece of land that was granted to them. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Indigenous Initiatives Office here on campus, and I invite you to acknowledge the location where you are. So, to the speaker of today, Professor Caetano Dorea, Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Victoria, where he leads the Public Health and Environmental Engineering Lab and the Answer Create program in water and sanitation for low resource context. Hashtag Wash Canada is where you can find more information about that program. Dr. Caetano Dorea's interests and expertise are at the crossroads of environmental and public health engineering. This includes the development and evaluation of water and sanitation and wastewater technologies, field and operator appropriate water, wastewater, fecal sludge, quality analytical methods, and functional ecology characterization of biological treatment systems for safeguarding the health of the public and the environment. His activities are focused mainly on so-called low resource contexts, which are found in low, middle, but also in high income countries. And these projects range from the development of methods for the online monitoring and control of disinfection byproducts in small Canadian municipalities to the delivery of safe water and sanitation for humanitarian relief. And in view of the fact that it's later this week, World Toilet Day, is my understanding you will talk today about sanitation management and challenges. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us here at University of Waterloo. Let's give him a hand of applause.
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction and the invitation to come here. As we mentioned, it's going to be World Water Day, so I thought it would be appropriate to talk about one of my big passions and talk about toilets before lunch, right? That's always a good topic. I'll do a little bit more about myself, but I'm also, the University of Victoria is located on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen, Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanich peoples. So acknowledging where I work, live, and play. And I am very fortunate to live there and to live in these lands. So a little bit about me, and we're going to talk, I changed the title a little bit because I thought it was too presumptuous to talk about all the implications. And so I just added some of the implications. And about myself, I'm originally from Brazil. So I did my undergraduate degree in University of Brasilia. I did a small stint in the University of Kansas, and then back to Brazil, and then doing my graduate work in the University of Surrey in the UK. And so those are sort of the yellow stars of where I studied, and that's where my interest in water and sanitation started with, in a very haphazard, serendipitous way, I got involved in this, and then I guess I never looked back. My history with Canada started in 2006. I did a postdoc with Health Canada, and then sort of academic progression, and I should stop moving. So Glasgow, back to Canada at Laval, and then I think the last stop is going to be now in Victoria, hopefully. I love it there. And so this has led me to a lot of places, but none of this work is just myself. This is through a network of collaborators and different agencies, so both academic, but also working a lot with not-for-profits, UN agencies, and humanitarian agencies. So a little bit about our lab. So we work in a few different dimensions, and I'm still not sure if this is the best way to represent it, but I'm going with it. So on one side, what I won't talk about today is the stuff we do in drinking water. And I don't know if it's a spectrum. I think there's a continuum and they're linked, but we also do, and which is the talk today about sanitation. And then I do conventional drinking water and wastewater stuff that helps pay the bills at UVic and keep the lights going. But my real passion is working in different low resource settings. And as mentioned in the introduction, low resource settings are not limited to low and middle income countries. Inequities exist everywhere. So here in Canada, we have, embarrassingly, still a lot of those. Excuse me. And so sometimes we're working with small municipalities on how to estimate disinfection byproducts so they can take remedial action. And where our work is more of a continuum is identifying problems, real-world problems, testing solutions out in the lab. So here is, I need to change this picture. Camille graduated 2 weeks ago. So, and then also doing a lot of field work. So then that's working. So identifying problems, testing these hypotheses in the lab, going back, figuring out solutions, and testing with local partners, observing new problems, bringing them back into the lab, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about, refer to the term WASH. I think, are most people familiar with when I say WASH, what that means? Water, sanitation, hygiene, yeah. Has everyone ever seen the F diagram? Is that, okay, so this is in the WASH, this is the love language of everyone who does WASH. And the F diagram is basically it's fecal-oral transmission route, which in a fancy Latin way of saying turd to tongue, basically. It is a sanitation talk after all. But the idea here is sort of depicting different routes of transmission. So our work is focused a lot on engineering interventions to try and improve or prevent disease transmission, so health related, but acknowledging that sanitation goes beyond that, right? So WASH is one of the barriers we could put. We have interventions in water quantity, hygiene, and also water quality. So it's just one of many approaches to do it, and that's just dealing with health. There's well-being, gender equity, a whole range of other issues that fall into WASH. So the size of the problem I'm going to talk about today is like 4 out of 10 people in the world still live surrounded by human excrement. Right? And what that means is it's leaving a lot of the most vulnerable populations, so children and elderly, to the risk of these diarrheal diseases. And to sort of illustrate the impact of, especially on children, and that's why, for example, UNICEF is the UN agency that's custodian of most WASH activities, is because children are the most impacted. So this is 2 growth curves. On the top is the growth curve of my son, who doesn't know I'm using his photos, but he's still under 18, so I can do that. So Emilio is following the growth curve, and anyone with small kids or who's been around small kids knows or will learn that, kids come in different sizes, and as long as they stay on the growth curve, that means they're off to a healthy trajectory. And so this is data from the 1960s. I think it was from Guatemala. And on the bottom is a growth curve of a child who does not have the same privileges as Emilio. And so what you see is every dot here is a visit to a clinic where they weigh the child. And under the visit, there's either a D, which is marking a diarrheal episode, ARI, acute respiratory infection. So if we remember anything from COVID, is washing your hands. So again, water related. or fever or some sort of infection. And as you can see, the point is when you fall off the growth curve and you stay off, this is when you start having long-term effects of these. So just to illustrate the importance of WASH, and then now things are gonna get a little bit more graphic and show you what inadequate sanitation is. So we can all use our imaginations, but I feel this is one of the photos that I still use, and is from one of my first field assignments. So we're looking at a internally displaced persons camp after the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan. So people are lost their houses, are living in camps. And I can't remember the backstory, but you see that one latrine is very different from the others. Now let's take a look inside, shall we? Disclaimer, these will be a little graphic. So, but we are here to talk about inadequate sanitation. So this is what the conditions can be when we talk about inadequate sanitation. And that's when you have a toilet. But most likely this toilet won't get used for very long, and we'll start to see the effects of not having proper facilities or services. So from here, we did an inspection around, and what we started to see is what open defecation is. So when there's no sanitation facilities, we have daily needs, and so people will find places to go. And this is probably in the surroundings of this camp. This exposes not only people to disease, but women might be attacked when trying to find a place to relieve themselves. There is no privacy or dignity. Bringing this back to the health perspective, what we saw in doing this inspection around the camp is, well, if you're going to relieve yourself, it's very convenient to do it near a source of water. So this was the case here. And following this source of water a little bit down, that was the same source of water used for the camp. So that's the F diagram in real life. And these examples are pervasive, right? We can talk about different conditions. And this is in a rural context. So when we go into, for example, a more urban context, has anyone heard of flying toilets here? No? So flying toilets are not these, but there are some amusing ones that are musical videos people have done of flying toilets that you can Google. But they're actually these. So when you have to seek privacy, sometimes this is done in the privacy of people's homes. So a plastic bag is used. You relieve yourself in a plastic bag and fling it as far away from your home as you can. So I think the Kibera slum in Nairobi is the most notorious for, that's where the flying toilets were, that term was coined. And there are certain times of the day where it's said you just know the flying toilets are going to fly, so you stay indoors during those times. But as you can imagine, there's an accumulation of this waste and a propagation or conditions that leave it more amenable to propagation of disease, et cetera. So bringing us to SDGs, our SDG target 6.2 is sort of what I want to talk about today is essentially universal and equitable access to safely managed sanitation services and special attention to the needs of women and girls. So when I say safely managed, I'm going to talk a little bit more from the perspective of environmental health, of pollutants, contaminants, but safely also means one that has privacy, one that is safe to access, that's lit at night, so preferably within a household. And that's the metric the joint monitoring program of UNICEF and WHO are using to monitor our progress towards these goals. And then it's important also to note that in previous times, like in our MDG era, we would count the access to what type of toilet we had. And so we've progressed to move beyond that. So we no longer just look at access to a toilet, but safely managed sanitation services means you have a service chain that goes with it. Otherwise, what happens if, for example, the pit latrine gets full? it gets emptied out and into a non-safe way. So something that safely managed has all these elements. So for most of us here in this room, probably we have access to a toilet, and if we're connected to a sewerage system, that's going to be conveyed to a centralized treatment facility, and then so on and so forth. But I'll talk about what happens when we're using on-site systems. So previously, in the MDG area, we looked at just access to toilets. And so depending on the type of toilet or the lack thereof, if you were unfortunate enough we didn't have one, it's open defecation, unimproved, shared, and basic. So those were the categories we would classify. And now to be considered safely managed, we want all those elements of the service chain. There is what's called a sanitation ladder, and I'm not sure this is the best way forward, but there's this idea that, a simple pit latrine might be something we can start with and slowly work our way up the sanitation ladder to, I'm not sure if it's the right thing, but we consider the gold standard is to have tertiary water treatment, wastewater treatment. And we can discuss whether we're thinking ahead or given all the different contaminants we're finding and scarcity of resources, if that's the right approach to have. So what does this look like? And we also use the term a lot, fecal sludge management. So I have a few photos from Kampala, Uganda. So this is a pit latrine. And here we have what you see in the pit latrine is a pump. And so that pit latrine is now full. Its service capacity it can't be used anymore. And it's being pumped out into these little buckets. So it's not the most, it's a very respectable job. And in this case, it's a good example. We see workers with adequate protection, trained with proper facilities. So this is a good example of fecal sludge management. So this is a bit of a peri-urban, densely packed, so we can't get trucks into these places. So usually these buckets are then emptied out into these barrels, onto these sort of motorcycle adapted vehicles that are a bit, can go through narrow roads. These are then emptied into a larger tanker truck, and these are taken to a centralized facility. The treatment process is very basic. It undergoes drying, and then the liquid portion might go to a waste stabilization pond, and finally we are left with dried sludge that's applied in agriculture. So this is a reasonably good example, but in most cases, fecal sludge management will look like this. So informal workers that don't have PPEs emptying out these pit latrines. These go into a barrel, and this barrel just gets discharged into the environment, right? So the benefits of having access to a toilet, in this case, we had that benefit. But the minute we're emptying out this untreated sludge into the environment, we've already neglected all of that. So the estimate is that here is about 1 cubic meter of sludge. That's equivalent to 1,000 people having open defecation, right? Just in terms of some simple estimates we can do in terms of the organic loading of that. So that's not what we want. And globally, this is our current situation. So 40%, so 60% of our wastewater produced is not treated, goes into environment untreated, and we can still question whether that 40% is adequately treated. So in these estimates, on-site sanitation, things like septic tanks, enter this estimate of these 40% that are treated. So to me, treatment, and this is what a lot of these estimates use, is if you are connected to a centralized facility that does at least secondary treatment, that's the definition of treatment. And if you put in on-site systems into this we need to question whether on-site systems can actually deliver this treatment, or what, right? And that's sort of what our research focus is on. So this all started with us looking back at design criteria for these systems, and there's one key assumption. So most of these design guidelines that date more than 70 years assume that there's going to be aerobic conditions in these pits or in the septic tank, and those anaerobic conditions are going to degrade the fecal sludge, thereby lessening the frequency of the emptying that's needed. And I'm going to focus more on secondary treatment and whether that is actually, can we consider that equivalent to, I'm going to focus on septic tanks and ask the question, can we equate that to secondary treatment? Or are we overestimating actually how much of the global wastewater is actually treated? So as you can see, we're very skeptic about septic tanks, and this led us to produce our first comic strip. So Kelsey, who is an ex-Waterloo student, so thank you very much. She's doing her PhD now, and we had a poster in a previous conference, and this was, I'll present a little bit about the work we've been doing. And the idea was to start questioning these highly used, so it's more than 50%, about 50% of the world population uses on-site systems, and septic tanks are one of the most common ones. So these highly used and under-researched, right? So we wanted to look at what's the evidence, if there is any treatment going on, what type, how much can we rely on it? And the idea was not to say, hey, we can't use septic tanks anymore. No, these are very useful, but I think as engineers, as policymakers, it's not the problem isn't to use a technology that has limitations. The problem is not to know the limitations of the technology we want to use. So that's a bit of the approach we have to this research. We want to find out what's happening to the effluent. So this is ongoing work that's happening. This led us to try and estimate, well, what are the greenhouse gas emissions of these? So are there any implications there? And more importantly, can we detect the relevant microbial activity? So wastewater engineering has largely been designed in a black box approach. We assume things happen, we monitor certain parameters, but we don't fundamentally understand the microbiology of these systems. So we wanted to shed a bit more light into this, and that's what Kelsey's doing now in her PhD. So this was the previous work. That happened, we intended to do the microbiology work first, and then, I don't know if everyone remembers, in 2020 there was a thing called the pandemic. So we reverted back to desk studies, and so we did a systematic review of all the literature that had been published on these systems to find what can we say about how these systems work. So the framework we developed was, well, first of all, do we have evidence there's anaerobic conditions? So if that's the assumption, at least the environmental conditions need to be there for that. Is the relevant anaerobic microbiology there? So do the microorganisms we assume that are going to do this treatment, are they even present? And if they're present, we want to be able to say, well, are they active, right? So one thing is to detect presence, another thing is to detect activity. So we scoured the literature, and basically our conclusions are that these are poorly understood systems, and at best, we can count on them for primary treatment. So this is essentially a settling tank, and all our dissolved organics, nutrients, all the rest are going to go into the environment. And that's the second bit we're working on now. It's trying to figure out what happens, what's the fate of these, and can these be engineered in a way to produce better treatment. And a key question we couldn't answer with this was, did we find evidence of anaerobic activity? And that's where we did lab work, some preliminary lab work to confirm this. So we sampled different sludges. We sampled anaerobic reactors. So these are engineered reactors from municipal treatment plants, and used that as a positive control. Ran just developing this protocol, and we did what's known as a SMA test. So that's called a specific methanogenic activity test. And the idea is we use our sludge as our inoculum. We feed it different substrates, and we try and find the response to these substrates. And if we find a positive response, in this case through gas production, then we know that's evidence of some activity happening. And so just to give a glimpse on some of the results, we did these with two types of samples. One was with fecal sludge from septic tanks, and we also collected fresh feces. So we wanted to know the inputs to the system and also what happens to the sludge once it's in, has been sitting there for a while. And we got two different responses. However, the main, I think, finding here is when we fed it acetate, and that's the basic assumption of anaerobic degradation. Usually it's implied that we have what's known as acetoclastic methanogenesis. And we saw that the acetate compared to our blank, which is the black line, never gave statistically significant differences. So we're not seeing evidence of acetoclastic methanogenesis. And one thing that intrigued us, but we're a little bit intrigued, I think something happened to this test, is we were getting a lot of formation of, when we added formate, of hydrogenotrophic activity. Now, why is this hydrogenotrophic? Anyone heard of hydrogenotrophic methanogenesis? Well, sitting here in this room, everyone has these organisms in your intestinal gut, and that's the reason why. So a lot of this research, I'm going to go on a tangent here. A lot of this research happened in the space race. So we were sending astronauts into space. They were going to be confined in these capsules for weeks on end. And as human beings, they were going to flatulate. And NASA researchers were interested, well, will they not kill themselves, right? And luckily they won't, because we produce a lot of hydrogen, but in our guts we have methanogens that can use that hydrogen to produce methane, which doesn't kill us like hydrogen would. So that's a contribution of space race to sanitation, I guess. But this sort of flipped on the head a lot of the assumptions we're having. So now we're seeing evidence that the activity we think or was assumed in these design guidelines is actually not happening. And this led us to linking that activity, or the lack thereof, a reduced activity, sustainable development goals, and the greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, we wanted to weigh sort of these two SDGs of achieving safely managed sanitation services with climate action. So what would be if we're going to invest in it, would there be an environmental cost, and what would that be? And what we're seeing is also this sort of assumption that these treatment systems can treat anaerobically, can degrade anaerobically waste, has led to the IPCC emission factors that we believe are overestimated. So looking at literature and field-derived greenhouse gas emissions from these systems, we've seen that, well, we proposed an improved emission factor for these different types of sanitation facilities, and we did some modeling. So the modeling consisted of modeling the greenhouse gas emissions using both the IPCC and the improved factors, and we had 3 scenarios. So one in which open defecation is not solved, so we have our current rates of open defecation. A second scenario, which is our second best, which was we are continuing on our current trend of sanitation delivery, which will not fulfill the SDGs. We're not on track, but with the improvement of at least open defecation. And the third scenario, which was our aspirational one, is if we achieve SDGs, what would they look like? And so what we see is, that those emission factors, so in the B letters are estimates using the improved factors, that actually emission factors are at least half of what could be generated by the IPCC emission factors. and that we have different levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to put this into perspective, this is very small anthropogenic contribution to the total. And also, importantly, the idea was not to say, well, we can't do this because there are greenhouse gases. Sanitation is a basic human right. And so in order to move, and in this idea of ending open defecation, there is a environmental justice component there that justifies why we would have to live with these factors. And notably, if we calculate, there's a lot of research on emission factors from conventional wastewater treatment, and they're much higher than this. And we don't question that approach either. How am I doing for time? We have 30 minutes? Yeah, 10, 15? Yeah, I should be, I think, wrapping in a few. So where this work is going now is we want to now take this more global and take it to the field. So this was largely impacted by COVID, but now we're doing more sampling sites. So Kelsey, we've partnered with Sandek at EVAG, and we're working with Linda Strande and her group, and Kelsey is looking at different, we're trying to measure the gradient, so we're doing a more detailed resolution of sampling within the pits, so looking at both physical chemical characteristics as well as microbial analysis, conducting household surveys so to understand, does the behavior of the household influence the performance of this pit? The microbial analysis, we're trying to dig a bit deeper into the method, using methods like metagenomics and metatranscriptomics, and running these reactor tests to see, can we measure the activity? And finally, as well as doing more of this field-derived greenhouse gas emissions. And to sort of fuel some discussions and looking ahead and in the future and what's in the crystal ball is, well, I don't think we will meet these targets. Our trajectories are already set. 2030 is less than 10 years away. So we need to start thinking about what comes next. And so this is an opportunity to sort of question, well, is this the gold standard we should be aiming for, right? And I think there's a lot of questioning we can do. And this doesn't get a lot of traction in Canada. Like when we talk about, for example, how we approach our current, so one of our students coined this, the term was the porcelain dream, is we can use our flush toilets and forget about it. But essentially, we put in a lot of time and energy, so that has an environmental cost to treat this waste, using drinking water, by the way, that we put a lot of time and energy to treat in the first place. I think we consume, what, 2 liters per day? And what's the consumption here, Monica, for? 1.6. But the delivery is what, 200 liters per capita, or?
Oh, you mean?
Drinking water?
You mean how much we produce in the region?
Yeah, but I guess the figure in what, consumption?
Yeah.
And it's 200 liter per capita, yeah. So we use about 1% to drink, and we flush and do other stuff without that. So it's, but I find in Canada with the Great Lakes, it's always hard to make that argument, right? Is this water-intense system really justifiable? But we're still left with an end product, and if anyone's familiar with Victoria now, biosolids is a huge, huge issue. So Victoria, we just got our first treatment plant commissioned 2 years ago. So before that, we were essentially dumping everything into the Sailor Sea. And unfortunately, it's a missed opportunity. So we were delivered a state-of-the-art 1970s treatment plant. Which I was very disappointed with. But that's sort of, our systems are still linear, right? We aren't thinking about, we're starting to think about reusing some of these resources, such as the energy that's embedded in it, water, nutrients, et cetera. But I think we're still a bit away from that, even in the conventional treatment systems. And we're not even thinking about that yet for these on-site systems. So there's thinking to be done there, right? And so when we start having water crises, like we saw in Cape Town, a lot of the stuff that was reported in the media was it was a water crisis, but when you speak to people on the ground, that was actually a sanitation crisis. So there was no water to flush toilets. The same thing happened years later in Sao Paulo, Australia, and we could cite several other examples. So does it make sense to continue with these water-intensive systems for sanitation? And the reality is that these systems probably won't work in a lot of low and middle income countries. In terms of resources, we've heard about oil wars, water wars, but we need to start thinking about phosphorus wars. So has anyone seen this image on the left? So that's the largest conveyor belt in the world. So it is going from, and it's in Western Sahara, that is a conflict zone. So Morocco has taken a lot of this, and these are one of the few phosphorus reserves on Earth. So if we can recover some of these nutrients from sanitation, think about every time you flush, you're contributing to world peace, right? This is some estimates of peak phosphorus. That's the year 2040. So these are intrinsically linked to food systems. And so if we don't change how we approach sanitation, and here we have 60% of the world without adequate treatment, this is the opportunity to rethink how we're going to provide treatment in face of the current crisis and dwindling resources of our lifestyles. The world is also changing. So if we look at the cities in which most of these located where there's a lack of these sanitation services, these are a lot in low and middle income countries, and the projection is that those are the next mega cities of the end of the century. So it's a changing world, a changing demographic, and that's part of what we need to think about when designing new systems. So this is our history of wastewater treatment. So starting with the Romans, the Cloaca Maxima was the greatest advance at the time. Victorian sewers were a solution to the cholera outbreaks of the 1800s. Activated sludge, we've just celebrated a few years back, 100 years of activated sludge. But what's next? And that's sort of I think it's an exciting time. And I know we can do it. So if we look at sort of cell phones, how much they've evolved, why can't sanitation have that sort of, Apple's going to start selling toilets, maybe. But it's an exciting time in sanitation. So there's a lot of new technologies, so things like biochar, composting, black soldier flies. So these are larvae that can consume directly fecal sludge and transform them into a source of protein. So we can start to look at other streams to generate revenue and recover some of these resources. So a lot of this research is happening in the countries that don't have access to safely managed sanitation services. And I think that's a super exciting time. And what I hope to see in the future is we always talk about a north-south migration of ideas, but I think the future of sanitation is going to be different, right? And I always say, if we can solve sanitation issues in Kampala, there's not a city in the world we can't tackle, right? So that's an exciting time to be around the sort of creative ideas and how people are tackling this. And with this, I'll just have my next to last slide, which is my shameless plug for the Answer Create. So this is sort of the environment which I think for scientists and engineers who want training with real-world problems can have this sort of exposure to how to tackle a problem in a completely different manner, changing the paradigms. And I think that's a really good training environment for engineers. So you can deliver a project with under budget, on time, fit for purpose. That's not a wash engineer, that's actually a perfect engineer, right? So with that, I'll finish here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Caetano. We have time for questions. Please briefly introduce yourself and speak in the microphone.
Thank you. Thomas, graduate. I'm wondering, like, because I've heard, like, recently that the Gates Foundation also had, like, some sort of, like, toilet that's supposed to be water efficient.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
Yeah,
could be used.
that's the Omni, I think it's the Omni toilet, or, so the Gates Foundation had a, I think it goes back probably 15 years, they had the Reinvent the Toilet contest, right? First, it wasn't an open contest, so, and as you can see, I'm a little bit skeptical about it. The idea was they had to produce toilets that were, I think it was, the operating costs had to be under $1 a day, which in many countries is still very expensive. So these are toilets that are still prototypes largely, I think. And I think the sector was at first very skeptical of these. And the good thing of these prototypes that were developed with the Gates Foundation is they brought sanitation to the forefront. So rather than being some obscure folks that like to dig into pit latrines, now it's a topic people are talking about, and there was excitement around it. So the way to see these prototypes, and someone once described to me, and I like that, is every time you see a new technology that seems to be the silver bullet, think of it more like when you go to a car expo and there's the concept car, right? So the concept car is something like you look at and you say, well, that'll never work. But it's cool, right? And so this is sort of, a lot of these, they are over-designed for the context in which we want to apply them. And I think that, we can understand systems that currently exist. So we already have pit latrines and septic tanks. There's ways to make them safe. We just need to understand how they work a bit better. Like, can we rely on them for treatment? I'm not saying that I think they will provide any treatment, but if we're going to design policies around, well, let's install more septic tanks, at least we need to know, we're only achieving a partial degree of treatment, and we have to live with the contamination that comes from them. So I deviate a bit from the Gates Foundation question, but I think a lot of these are still at a prototype stage, and that's the key question, is can you scale these up?
So Caetano, EWAC actually has toilets that don't use water. Have you seen them?
Yeah, that's the blue toilet, I think is
so.
the one. Yeah, so they were
so
one of the ones in there. And again, the question is, they work. There's a high degree of technical input to keep the projects going. It's whether these projects can even be sustainable on their own. Like, that's the ultimate goal, right? Yeah.
And let's not forget the human aspect, because it's been, at least in one of the Christmas parties at EWAC, a focal point of laughter and critique and protest. There is a bit of protest again. You need, for example, how do you call this? These exhaust pipes above them, because of the stench.
Yeah.
So there's been some human related issues of acceptance of those kind of toilets as well.
Yeah.
Monica, next question.
So first, I'm going to say I misunderstood consumption, and you really meant how much was coming to the house. So it's 350 in Canada?
350.
Yeah, and in the
and
US
that's with,
it's more like 425.
and that's with losses, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still pretty high.
It's
right?
still high.
Yeah. So we use a lot of water, and we don't probably need to use that much, right? But I have a question for you. Like, I think this is a really important discussion around sanitation, and I wanted to ask you, for a fourth-year student thinking about going to grad school, maybe, it's easy to enter into this discussion, but you very quickly get to what are the key driving constraints. Mm-hmm. So do we want technologies at a household level? There are people who would come out and say we can do direct potable reuse. Mm-hmm. The question is, of course, how much do you want to pay for it? So is cost a critical factor? To people who are very intrigued by these questions, what would you say are the key constraints that would drive beyond that we need, basic hygiene and sanitation? When we get to sanitation, what are the key constraints? Yeah,
so I think there's a whole system to consider, right? So there's financial constraints. So are the resources there to implement the solution we want? Is there political will? Like that, I think, not just for sanitation, but anywhere to implement anything. Are the regulatory systems ready for this? So one big one big hindrance is, for example, in many countries, pit latrines and septic tanks aren't considered a form of sanitation. They're not even in the regulatory framework. Why? Because a lot of the regulatory framework is mirrored on things that happen in Europe and North America. So we're in I'm just going to choose a continent, but let's assume I'm in a African country. So even our regulatory framework isn't ready for it, and there is time that's changing. And then there's social cultural, right? So the example of acceptance of these. So there's a human element. There's a lot of other elements that I think, especially in engineering, we don't see in Canada come out when we are going to design a treatment plant. The regulatory framework is there. We have a parameter. We have all our boundary conditions are there. And I think these boundary conditions to how to implement these projects in low resource contexts many times are complex and still evolving or undefined. Yeah.
I think last year or so there was a study by the World Bank. I'm not sure if it was the World Bank, but they estimated that it would take less than 1% of global GDP to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 6 objective. So the costs are, they may be significant, but on a global scale compared to what we
and
produce.
That's political will, right?
Yeah.
So for example, some of these projects there's very interesting propositions of container-based sanitation in Haiti. So this is households receiving a bucket, basically, and that bucket is exchanged with a certain frequency, so the waste is collected, and that's a paid service. And one of the biggest critiques this project has is it's not financially viable. And it's like, well, you would question, is the military financially viable? Like, what profit? So it's an essential service. So I think that the question of when we get into the economics of it is like, there's a sense that this has to be economically sustainable, but as many essential services are, is you pay in to get a service. It's not, yeah.
We did a study with Susan Elliott, who you know, I think, and with someone from cultural anthropology in Dhaka, one of the megacities that you showed. We simply looked at the cost of illness compared to the cost of investments that are required to get rid of open defecation, treat the fecal sludge, and just based on that comparison, you can show that the costs of illness are factors of or orders of magnitude higher than the investment
I think it's
cost.
1 to 9. So $1 invested, $9 in return in health benefits. That's one of the estimates. Yeah.
Yeah. We have another question here.
Hi. I don't know if you covered this or not because I just ran here from class.
Okay.
But you kind of talked about technology, and with technology we have cell phones, right? But it doesn't cover everything. We still have laptops, we still have tablets, and some people still have like computer systems. And so when it comes to the whole thing about toilets and how they waste a lot of water, has it been looked at? We can still have toilets, but we're going to use that only for liquids, right? So we need much less water, and then we have composting. So instead of looking at one toilet that does everything, we can look into having maybe 2 or even 3 types of toilets and bathrooms.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question and observation, is because it makes us think of us as humans, right? So at the end of the day, it's would this be acceptable? And so how do you go from, there's a lot of yuck factor around toilets. So a key example is at UVic. Am I still being recorded? Off the record. We're designing a new building, and it was supposed to be a green building because the department is branding itself as green civil engineering. So I was super excited. I was like, all right, so composting toilets. Let's reduce our water footprint. That was the first thing they parked. It's like, oh yeah, nice idea, but I don't think we're going to do this, right? So there's a lot of resistance to change, but there are many good examples. So source separating is one way to achieve to recover these nutrients. But a really good example at scale is Singapore. So Singapore has a lot of its water comes from Malaysia. It doesn't have its own water sovereignty. So in order to guarantee or to have less reliance on importing water, they've now started doing water reuse. So it's, I think, one of the largest water reuse projects in the world. But a lot of their investment wasn't just in technology, was with, if I gave you a glass of water and I said, oh, this was treated wastewater, if I could brand it much better and it would be more acceptable. So I think the way we're going to change this has to have these other components. So it's not just the technology. Right?
Thank you, Nanita.
Hi, Nandita. Fascinating talk, Caetano. So I'll ask a question that is kind of related to not so much my science, but kind of the way I grew up, right? So I grew up in India. The open defecation pits that you saw, I grew up seeing them. We grew up in an India when I think, at least my understanding of it, it was a realm between open defecation to households that had Eastern style toilets that you poured water through and buckets that you used for having a bath. India has changed a lot in those last 15 years, so you can see Western style toilets everywhere. And showers, every house has a shower, so that's a huge, so there is money that has poured in. But, so this is kind of this question about kind of the fascination for everything that's Western and bringing those in as the epitome of what needs to happen, and kind of, I mean, whether the Western toilet is the way to go, and you alluded to it, right, in these different, or is it better to take the system that is, which is water efficient in a lot of ways, and improve on it. And I find one of the things that I saw this last time that I went, there's a lot of wastewater treatment plants that have been built with a lot of money. They're not functional because there is not enough training of people to operate them. So what you were bringing up, somehow I feel it's not a money question. There is money. It's kind of the way we do it. In that space.
But I think that touches on what Monica, like the systems around it need to be there for these to work. And I think that's a good example. We talk a lot about decolonizing research, right? And that's a good example of why is that the solution, right? And so for me personally, that's been my journey in water and sanitation. I started off designing the next system that was going to save the world. And I quickly found out that every country we were going to or we're working with is, you know what, this stuff I did doesn't make sense. You already have the solution there. So our research now has shifted from doing that to developing systems or techniques to evaluate systems that already exist, because I think there's great value in indigenous technologies that are being used and have been used already, right? So composting is nothing new, right? That's at least, what, 1,000, 2,000? So we just need to figure out how to better implement these and create the systems around them for them to function properly. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Very excellent. And also just, I really love that thread of conversation that's going, but I'm going to change the topic. So my name's Danica, and I was wondering about kind of phosphorus for use in the food production. You kind of lightly touched on it. And I was wondering, in the kind of communities you've worked with internationally, do you see kind of accepting attitudes of using this sludge for crop production, or I think I've seen it called night soil also. And then, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like in Canada there's a lot of this kind of icky factor. There's an
yuck factor.
Yuck factor, exactly. And I think that kind of conversation in Canada doesn't, I don't know, I think the public would have a hard time. And I'm just wondering, is this universal?
Yuck factor, yeah. I mean, I think it just comes from disgust, which is, we've evolved to be disgust, right? And rightly so, to avoid these diseases. But I think it's how, like, just with this example from Singapore, I think there's ways to brand it, right? So not so much in the sanitation sector, but if we look at efforts that are being made in the hygiene. So hand washing is a change of behavior, right? There's statistics that if I ask how many people here wash their hands after using the washroom, I think everyone's going to raise their hand. There's studies that have been shown that, and I've seen this, and I'll speak only for UVic people. I don't know at Waterloo. But I've been in the washroom, and I see people leaving the stall and going out, like behind my back while I'm washing. So I know it's not 100%, right? And these things are behavioral. So there's a lot of research. There's people paid to make us addicted to cigarettes, Coca-Cola. Like, they can change our behaviors that way. So I think that's a lot of the hygiene sector is focusing, has a lot of work on that. And I think that's something that the sanitation sector can learn from. Because if we want to have these changes in perception and towards a new technology, that's how it's marketed and things. So that's not my area of expertise, but I know of these and are happening. And it's just, yeah, so in Victoria there's this, right? So the biosolids we're producing, they're right now we pay a cement factory to burn it in their kiln. And so it's a resource for them, and we're paying them. It's crazy. And because we can't dump it, and there's resistance, yeah.
Okay, last question, Monica.
I was just hoping, so Monica Milko, Civil Engineering, I didn't introduce myself before, so I apologize. I was wondering, I think this is such an important discussion, and I feel like we so rarely have the opportunity to just calmly and thoughtfully have it, right? Because there's always the next speaker, the next talk, whatever. And I wanted to ask your opinion on some of the challenges. So my work tends to focus more on drinking water. And when I come and I listen to talks, and I loved your talk, I thought it was great, I'm like, yes, we can do this. And then I start to think about, all right, well, how will we deal with this? And so I was wondering if you could comment on one of the big technical obstacles that we're often faced with when we talk about sanitation, which is if you're going to have these byproducts of sanitation, solids, whatever, one of the biggest obstacles for us is getting stuck on, well, what about the pharmaceuticals that people use? What about these materials that we don't want released into the environment?
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you could comment your perspective on it, because I know it's a challenge.
Absolutely, and these, so every challenge, and I say we here in Canada have with wastewater, pharmaceuticals, microplastics, like the list goes, PFAS, like the list will go on and on. The same thing everywhere else, right? But the challenge is, so one of the projects we're starting now is just try and put yourself in the feet of an operator at one of these fecal sludge treatment plants. So here in Canada, it doesn't arrive in a truck, it's piped in, take a grab sample, send it to a lab, get the results. We have that infrastructure. The truck driver, the operator, all they have is like, oh, that came from neighborhood X. It's looking a little green today. It's kind of sludgy. Let's leave it for 10 days. That's the analytical lab right there. So even the basic tools and so I think even that's where we want to try and shift the focus from the need. So speak of using what's used in high-income countries, standard methods. Like everyone, the regulatory, it's like the lab needs to use standard methods. Like there's no lab that can afford that, right? And that's what I would call more a research grade analytical technique. But what about something simple that what I call operational grade? So even from that perspective of how can we even start doing it, we don't have the tools yet. So when Anita talked about the operator capacity, is like, well, if we need a standard lab to do it, like there is no capacity. So we need to think of, and that's part of the system, right? So making tools that I think as engineers or problem solvers, if you can't measure the problem, you can't solve it. So these are sort of that's a small challenge from the technical side. Then it goes on from, like, I have no idea of how we'll deal with microplastics and all this list of, and I still have an idea how we're doing it in Canada, right? So the challenge is big, right? And part of it, as we know, it's well, there's the end of pipe treatment, but I think a lot of this is further upstream, which is not even an engineering, yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So join me please in thanking Dr. Caetano Dorea one more time.
Thank you.
For giving the presentation. Thanks very much.